The night sky over Normandy split open with thunder that had nothing to do with the storm clouds gathering above the English Channel. Private James Jimmy Donovan felt his stomach lurch as the C-47 Dakota shuddered through another pocket of flak-torn air, the aircraft's aluminum skin groaning like a wounded animal. Through the open door, he could see tracer rounds painting bright orange lines across the darkness, German anti-aircraft guns firing blindly into the churning clouds above the Atlantic Wall. 2 minutes. Sergeant Bull Thompson's voice cut through the engine roar, his massive frame silhouetted against the red jump light. The stocky paratrooper from Georgia had arms like tree trunks and a face weathered by 28 years of hard living, but his hands trembled slightly as he checked Jimmy's parachute straps one final time. "You remember what I told you, kid. Count to 4. Pull if it doesn't open, and for God's sake, stay away from those flooded fields. Rommel's turned half of France into a drowning pool." Jimmy nodded, his mouth too dry to form words. At 19, he was the youngest man in the stick, barely 6 months removed from his family's dairy farm in Wisconsin. His mother's last letter sat folded in his breast pocket, wrapped in wax paper to protect it from the rain. She'd written about the new calf, about his sister Mary's upcoming wedding, about how proud his father was, even though the old man would never say it out loud. The letter smelled like home, like fresh-cut hay and his mother's lavender soap, and Jimmy had read it so many times he'd memorized every loop of her handwriting. "Green light! Go, go, go!" Bull's shout snapped Jimmy back to the present. Bodies launched into the void ahead of him, swallowed instantly by the roaring darkness. Then it was his turn, and he was falling, tumbling through a sky that exploded with fire and fury. The slipstream tore at his face, and for one horrifying moment his chute didn't deploy. His hand found the reserve ripcord, but before he could pull, the main canopy blossomed above him with a violent jerk that nearly dislocated his shoulders. The sudden silence was deafening. Gone was the engine roar, replaced by the whisper of wind through silk and the distant crackle of gunfire. Jimmy floated through layers of smoke and cloud, glimpsing the checkerboard of Norman hedgerows far below, the distinctive bocage landscape that had looked so innocent in their reconnaissance photos. But now he could see the reality. Fields flooded with seawater by German engineers, wooden stakes jutting from the ground like dragon's teeth, and everywhere the geometric precision of Hitler's Atlantic Wall defenses that stretched from Norway to Spain. Something whizzed past his head, so close he felt the heat. More tracer rounds, this time aimed specifically at the paratroopers drifting helplessly in their harnesses. Jimmy tried to slip his chute to make himself a harder target, but the wind had other ideas. He was being pushed eastward, away from his designated drop zone near Saint-Mère-Église, toward a cluster of buildings that glowed with the orange light of fires already burning. The ground rushed up faster than he expected. His boots hit soft earth, and he rolled instinctively, the way they'd practiced 1,000 times at Fort Benning. His chute collapsed in a heap of white silk that seemed to glow in the darkness, a beacon for every German soldier within a mile. He fumbled with the harness releases, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline, and finally freed himself just as voices shouted somewhere to his left, guttural German commands that made his blood freeze. "Blitz! Blitz! Amerikanischer Fallschirmjäger!" Jimmy scrambled toward a hedgerow, dragging his rifle and equipment bag with him. The bocage was even more treacherous than he had imagined, ancient earthen banks topped with dense tangles of hawthorn and bramble, creating natural fortresses that carved the landscape into a maze of small fields. He pressed himself into the shadows at the base of the hedge, just as flashlight beams swept across the field where his parachute lay crumpled. His heart hammered so loudly he could certain the Germans would hear it. 3 soldiers emerged from the darkness, their coal scuttle helmets distinct against the lighter sky. They approached his abandoned chute cautiously, rifles raised, speaking in quick, nervous German. One of them, a young soldier who couldn't have been more than Jimmy's age, kept glancing at the sky as if expecting more paratroopers to fall on his head. A cricket clicker chirped somewhere in the darkness. Click-clack, click-clack. The recognition signal for the 101st Airborne. Jimmy's hand fumbled for his own clicker, but it was gone, torn away during his descent. Before he could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows behind the German soldiers. Sergeant Bull Thompson moved with surprising silence for such a large man, his trench knife glinting in the firelight. What happened next was over in seconds, brutal, efficient, and utterly without mercy. "Jimmy, that you, kid?" Bull's voice carried across the field. "Get over here. We need to move before their friends show up." Jimmy stumbled toward the sergeant, his legs weak with relief and delayed terror. Bull was wiping his knife on the uniform of one of the dead Germans, his face completely impassive. The young German soldier, the one who'd looked so nervous, stared sightlessly at the sky, a dark pool splitting beneath his head. "First time seeing it up close?" Bull asked, reading Jimmy's expression. He sheathed his knife and grabbed the German soldier's rifle, checking the action. "Better than him seeing you. Come on, we've got work to do. This whole operation's gone to hell. We're scattered from here to Paris, and the Germans have no idea what's happening. That's our one advantage." They moved through the bocage like ghosts, using the ancient hedgerows for cover. The sound of battle echoed from every direction. Machine gun fire, explosions, the occasional scream. Flares arced into the sky periodically, bathing the countryside in harsh white light that made the shadows seem even darker by contrast. Jimmy counted 5 distinct firefights within hearing distance, and the eastern horizon had started to glow with the light of burning buildings. After 20 minutes of careful movement, they came across a scene that made Bull hold up his fist in the Hulk signal. A small stone farmhouse sat in a depression between 2 hedgerows, its thatched roof partially collapsed from fire damage. Outside, a group of paratroopers had taken position behind a stone wall, their weapons trained on the house. Jimmy recognized Lieutenant Robert Winters, a square-jawed officer from Ohio who'd led their training exercises with methodical precision. "Sergeant Thompson, good to see you alive." Winters spoke in a harsh whisper, not taking his eyes off the farmhouse. "We've got a situation. There's a German machine gun nest in that house, at least 5 or 6 enemy soldiers. They've been here for hours, probably part of the Beach Defense Coordination Network. They've got telephone lines running from that house in 3 different directions. Intel says there's a whole communications hub in there, maps, code books, possibly even information on beach obstacles and mine placements." Bull studied the farmhouse, his experienced eyes taking in the tactical situation. "What's the play, Lieutenant?" "We need whatever's in there, Sergeant. 5th Corps is probably landing on Utah Beach right now, and they're going to hit every obstacle and strong point Rommel could dream up. If that house has current intel on beach defenses, it could save hundreds of lives. But we can't just blow it to hell. We need those documents intact." Jimmy watched as Winters laid out his plan, using hand signals to position men around the farmhouse's perimeter. There were 8 paratroopers in total, all that remained of a stick of 18 that had jumped together. The others were scattered across Normandy, dead in the flooded fields or captured by German patrols that roamed the countryside in increasing numbers. Among the survivors, Jimmy noticed Corporal Daniel "Doc" Martinez, a Mexican-American medic from Texas whose steady hands and calm demeanor had earned him his nickname long before they'd left England. Doc's uniform was soaked with what looked like blood, but he moved without any sign of injury, his medical bag clutched protectively against his chest. Beside him crouched Private Thomas Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco, whose parents had warned him he'd face just as much prejudice in the U.S. Army as he did on the streets back home. Tom had proved them right and wrong in equal measure. His skills with a rifle had earned grudging respect, but he still caught the occasional slur from men who should have known better. "Martinez, Chen, you 2 provide cover fire from that stone wall. Thompson, you take Donovan and Private Hayes around the left flank. When you're in position, I'll give the signal. We hit them fast, get what we need, and get out before every German in Normandy shows up for the party." Private Eddie Hayes was a wiry redhead from Boston, barely 5'6", but with a reputation for fearlessness that bordered on recklessness. He'd grown up in a rough neighborhood where fighting was as natural as breathing, and the transition to military combat had been seamless for him. He grinned at Jimmy as they gathered their gear, his teeth bright in his dirt-smeared face. "Stick close to Bull, farm boy. This is going to get messy." They moved out, circling wide through the bocage to approach the farmhouse from an angle the Germans wouldn't expect. The hedgerow maze worked in their favor now, concealing their approach even as it made navigation nearly impossible. Jimmy's uniform caught on thorns, and his boots sunk into mud that smelled of manure and something worse, the sweet, sick stench of death that he was already learning to recognize. Bull held his hand up again, and they froze. Voices carried from the farmhouse, German soldiers talking in normal tones, probably assuming they were safe behind the Atlantic Wall defenses that were supposed to make France impregnable. One of them laughed at something, the sound jarringly normal against the backdrop of distant explosions. Through a gap in the hedge, Jimmy could see a German soldier standing in the doorway, smoking a cigarette. The man looked tired, middle-aged, with the kind of soft belly that suggested he'd spent more time behind a desk than in combat. Bull's hand moved in a series of quick signals. Wait, watch, be ready. Jimmy's finger found his rifle's trigger, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, the way they'd taught him. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Keep your heartbeat steady. Don't think about the man behind the rifle sight. Don't think about the letters in his pocket, about his mother learning from a Western Union telegram that her son had killed a stranger in a country she'd never seen. A flare shot up somewhere to the north, and in its brilliant light, Jimmy saw the full scope of what they were facing. The farmhouse wasn't just a simple defensive position, it was a nerve center. Telephone lines ran from it like spiderweb strands, connecting to other buildings across the Norman countryside. A staff car sat partially hidden behind the barn, its Wehrmacht markings clear even in the flickering light. This wasn't just a machine gun nest, this was something more important, something that the Germans had thought was safely behind their impregnable defenses. The flare died, plunging us back into darkness that seemed even deeper by contrast. That's when Lieutenant Winters gave the signal. 3 sharp whistle blasts that shattered the night's false calm. Doc Martinez and Tom Chen opened fire from their position, their shots punching holes through the farmhouse's ancient stone walls. The German in the doorway crumpled, his cigarette describing a lazy arc as it fell in the mud. Return fire erupted from the house, a German MG-42 machine gun spitting rounds at a rate that made it sound like ripping canvas. Go! 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 Bull was up and running, his massive form surprisingly graceful as he covered the distance to the farmhouse's side wall. Jimmy and Eddie followed, their boots splashing through puddles that reflected the orange glow of fire. Jimmy's rifle barked twice, 3 times. He didn't know if he hit anything, didn't have time to think about it. All he knew was the desperate need to reach cover before that MG-42 found him. They hit the wall hard, pressing themselves against cold stone that had stood for probably 200 years and had never seen violence like this. Bull counted to 3 with his fingers, then kicked in the side door with one powerful blow. A German soldier appeared in the doorway, his face registering shock in the instant before Bull's rifle butt caught him in the temple. The man went down hard, and they were inside, moving through rooms that smelled of tobacco smoke and old stone and fear. The machine gun was in the main room, pointing out a blown-out window toward the position where Doc and Tom kept up their covering fire. 2 Germans crouched behind it, so focused on their target that they didn't hear the Americans until it was too late. Eddie Hayes's Thompson submachine gun chattered briefly, and then the only sounds were the ringing in Jimmy's ears and the harsh breathing of men coming down from combat adrenaline. Lieutenant Winters burst through the front door with the rest of the squad, his pistol trained on a German officer who stood with his hands raised. The man wore a captain's insignia and had the look of someone who'd spent this war moving pins on maps rather than dodging bullets. Behind him, a desk was covered with papers. Maps marked with precise military notations, typewritten documents with official Wehrmacht stamps, and what looked like a code book bound in brown leather. Doc, clear the rest of the house. Chen, watch that door. Thompson, get these papers secured. Donovan? Winters pointed at the German captain. Search him. Be thorough. Jimmy approached the German officer with his rifle raised, hyper-aware that this was his first direct interaction with the enemy. The captain was probably 40, with graying hair and the kind of soft hands that confirmed his rear echelon status. His eyes showed fear, but also calculation, and when he spoke, his English was nearly perfect. You cannot win this. The Atlantic wall is impregnable. Your paratroopers are scattered and lost. When dawn comes, the sea will run red with American blood. Your generals have sent you to die for nothing." "Shut up," Jimmy said, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. He patted down the German uniform, finding a Walther pistol, a notebook, and a small photograph of a woman and two children standing in front of a nice house somewhere far from this war. The woman was smiling, holding the younger child's hand. The older boy, maybe 10 or 11, wore a Hitler Youth uniform and stared at the camera with the kind of serious expression kids get when they're trying to look grown up. Jimmy pocketed everything except the photograph, which he let fall to the floor. The German captain's eyes followed it down, and for just a moment, his military bearing cracked. He looked like what he really was, a middle-aged man who wanted to go home to his family, who probably told himself he was just doing his duty, that he was defending his country rather than serving a regime that had set Europe on fire. Bull was already stuffing documents into his pack, his movements quick and efficient. "Lieutenant, we've got gold here. Beach obstacle layouts, minefield maps, defensive positions from here to Cherbourg. This is exactly what we need." "Then we move, now." Winters checked his watch. "H hour is in 3 hours. We need to get this intel to the beach." The explosion cut him off. The eastern wall of the farmhouse erupted inward, showering them with stone fragments and choking dust. Jimmy hit the ground hard, his ears ringing, his vision full of stars. When he looked up, he saw Bull's body lying motionless near the door, blood streaming from a head wound. Eddie Hayes was screaming something, but Jimmy couldn't hear the words. The German captain had made a break for the door during the confusion, and Tom Chen had put 2 rounds in his back without hesitation. "Mortars! They've got our position!" Doc Martinez was dragging Bull toward cover, his medic's instinct overriding everything. "We need to move!" Another explosion rocked the farmhouse, and this time part of the roof came down. Ancient timbers, burning thatch, and broken tiles crashed into the room where they'd been standing moments before. Lieutenant Winters grabbed Jimmy by the collar and hauled him toward the back door, while Tom and Eddie provided covering fire through windows that no longer had glass. They burst out into the night to find it transformed into hell. German soldiers were advancing from multiple directions, drawn to the firefight like sharks to blood in the water. Tracer rounds painted lines of fire across the darkness. Somewhere close by, a tank engine rumbled to life, the distinctive cough and growl of a Panzer Maybach engine that every Allied soldier had learned to recognize and fear.
"Split up," Winters shouted. "Get that intel to the beach. Thompson, you good?" Bull staggered to his feet, blood still running down his face but his eyes clear. "I've had worse bar fights, Lieutenant. Let's go." They scattered into the bocage, carrying with them secrets that could save hundreds of lives on the beaches below. Behind them, the farmhouse burned, and German voices raised the alarm across the countryside. Jimmy ran through the maze of hedgerows with Bull and Eddie, the weight of captured documents in his pack, feeling heavier than any burden he'd ever carried on his father's farm. The fate of the invasion, of everything, might depend on them reaching the coast before dawn brought the landing craft to shore. And somewhere ahead, beyond the confusion and violence of this impossible night, lay the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's fortress Europe that they'd been told could never be breached from within. But here they were, inside it, armed with knowledge and desperation in equal measure. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, the first hint of dawn touching the horizon like a promise or a threat. Jimmy had no idea which. He only knew that he was still alive, still moving, and that somewhere ahead lay a beach where thousands of his countrymen were about to discover whether the sacrifices of this night had been worth it. 3 months earlier, Jimmy Donovan had been lying in the hayloft of his father's barn in Wisconsin, watching dust motes dance in shafts of sunlight while he read a letter from his older brother Frank. The paper had been soft from repeated folding and unfolding, creased along the edges where Jimmy's hands had held it during those long winter nights when sleep wouldn't come and the future felt like a weight pressing down on his chest.
"Dear Jimmy," Frank had written in his careful, deliberate script, the penmanship of a man who'd learned to write in the same one-room schoolhouse where Jimmy had struggled through his own education. "The Army isn't what you think it is. It's not like the recruiting posters in town with those soldiers looking brave and clean. It's boredom and exhaustion and being so scared you can't remember your own name. But it's also something else, something I can't quite explain. It's knowing you're part of something bigger than yourself. Mom always said we were meant for quiet lives on the farm, but maybe she was wrong. Maybe we're meant for this. Take care of yourself, little brother. Don't let Dad work you too hard. And if they call your number, well, you'll know what to do when the time comes." Frank had been killed at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, cut down by German 88mm fire while trying to rally his squad after their tank had been hit. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by old Mr. Henderson from the post office, who'd driven out personally because some news was too terrible to trust to the regular mail. Jimmy had watched his mother's face crumble when she read those stark words, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret." His father had stood like a stone statue, his weathered hands clenched at his sides, refusing to cry even as something fundamental broke inside him. They'd buried Frank's personal effects in the small cemetery behind the Lutheran church where 3 generations of Donovans rested under simple granite markers. There was no body to bury, of course. Frank was somewhere in North Africa, in a military cemetery with row upon row of white crosses that looked identical from a distance. But his mother needed somewhere to grieve, so they'd held a service and buried a box containing Frank's high school diploma, his baseball glove, and that same letter Jimmy had read so many times, the words had become part of his own internal voice. 2 weeks after the funeral, Jimmy had walked into town and enlisted. He'd known his mother would try to stop him, that his father would rail against losing another son to a war that seemed to devour young men without ever being satisfied. But Frank's letter had planted something in him, a seed that grew into a terrible necessity. Someone had to fight. Someone had to stand against the darkness spreading across the world. And if that someone couldn't be Frank anymore, then it had to be Jimmy. The training at Fort Benning had been everything Frank's letter had promised. Brutal, exhausting, terrifying. But Bull Thompson had taken Jimmy under his wing from the first day, when Jimmy had nearly quit after a particularly vicious dressing down from a drill instructor who seemed to take personal offense at Jimmy's farm boy clumsiness. Bull had found him that night, sitting alone in the barracks, Frank's letter clutched in his hands. "You thinking about going home, kid?" Bull had asked, his Georgia drawl soft in the darkness. He'd sat down on the bunk across from Jimmy without waiting for an invitation, his massive frame making the military cot look like a child's toy. "I don't know if I can do this," Jimmy had admitted, the words tasting like failure. "I'm not like Frank. I'm not brave. I'm just what? Just a scared kid who signed up anyway?" Bull had leaned forward, his eyes catching the dim light from the hallway. "Let me tell you something about brave, Jimmy Donovan. Brave isn't feeling no fear. Brave is being scared shitless and doing it anyway. Your brother, Frank was it, he was probably terrified every day in North Africa, but he did his job. That's all anyone can ask." From that night on, Bull had become something between a drill instructor, a big brother, and a guardian angel. He'd worked with Jimmy on his marksmanship, staying late on the range long after the other men had returned to barracks. He'd taught him the subtle art of reading terrain, of moving through countryside the way his grandfather had once taught him to move through Wisconsin woods while hunting deer. And most importantly, he taught him that being a paratrooper wasn't about being fearless. It was about being part of a brotherhood that would never leave you behind. "Your brother did his job in a tank," Bull had said during one of their late-night training sessions as they practiced assembling and disassembling their weapons in complete darkness. "You're going to do yours from the sky. Different war, same principles.
take care of your buddies, follow your orders, and try not to get killed. Simple, right?
The other men in their unit had gradually become family. Doc Martinez had grown up in El Paso, the son of a veterinarian who'd hoped his boy would follow him into a respectable practice healing livestock and the occasional pampered pet. Instead, Doc had found his calling in the military, discovering that his steady hands and calm demeanor were exactly what was needed when men were bleeding out in the mud. He carried a small wooden crucifix his grandmother had given him, and Jimmy had seen him touch it unconsciously whenever they prepared for a jump, his lips moving in silent prayer. Tom Chen had a different story, one marked by the kind of casual prejudice that made Jimmy ashamed of his country even as he prepared to fight for it. Tom's parents ran a laundry in San Francisco, and they'd been lucky. Unlike so many of their Japanese-American neighbors, they hadn't been rounded up and sent to internment camps. But Tom had still grown up wearing the weight of being seen as perpetually foreign, perpetually suspect. The Army had offered him a chance to prove his American identity, though it came at the cost of being sent to jump out of perfectly good airplanes into German-occupied France. "My father thinks I'm crazy," Tom had confided one night while they'd been cleaning their rifles after a practice jump. "He said, 'Thomas, you're going to get yourself killed trying to convince white men that you belong here.' But I told him, this isn't about them. This is about knowing for myself that I belong." Eddie Hayes rounded out their core group, a Boston scrapper who'd grown up in the kind of Irish neighborhood where you learn to fight before you learn to read. He'd joined the Paratroopers on a dare, or so he claimed, though Jimmy suspected there was something deeper driving him. Eddie had the kind of reckless courage that could either save lives or end them, and Bull spent a lot of time trying to channel that energy into something useful rather than suicidal. The problem with Hayes, Bull had once told Jimmy while watching Eddie volunteer for yet another dangerous assignment, is that he's got something to prove and no clear idea what it is. He's going to get himself killed trying to be a hero and probably take some of us with him. Your job, kid, is to make sure that doesn't happen. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is pull a fool back from the edge. Their training had intensified as spring approached, and everyone knew the invasion was coming. They'd practice night jumps until they could do them in their sleep, though the dreams that followed were often nightmares of tangled chutes and drowning in flooded fields. They'd studied reconnaissance photos of French countryside until they could navigate the bocage blindfolded. And they'd been briefed endlessly on the Atlantic Wall, that massive fortification system that Hitler had built to make Europe impregnable. Lieutenant Winters had laid it out for them with characteristic precision, using a pointer to indicate positions on a large map that dominated one wall of their briefing room. The Atlantic Wall isn't a wall in the traditional sense. It's a system. Bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests, minefields, underwater obstacles, and beach defenses that stretch for thousands of miles. The Germans have spent years and billions of Reichsmarks building it. They think it's impregnable. "So why are we jumping behind it?" Eddie asked, his Boston accent thick with skepticism. "Because they're right. It probably is impenetrable from the front. The beaches are a killing ground, and every man who lands there is going to face hell on earth. Our job is to hit them from behind, to disrupt their communications, destroy their ability to reinforce the beaches, and capture key positions before they know what's happening. The Germans think the Atlantic Wall makes them safe. We're going to teach them otherwise." Jimmy had studied those maps until his eyes hurt, memorizing the positions of German strongpoints, the routes of patrol paths, the locations of ammunition depots and fuel depots. He'd learned the difference between regular Wehrmacht troops and the elite SS divisions, between the conscript soldiers from conquered territories and the fanatical Hitler youth who'd been raised on propaganda and truly believed in the 1,000-year Reich. But nothing in the training, nothing in the maps or briefings or Frank's letters had prepared him for the reality of combat. You couldn't train for the smell of death, for the sound a man made when bullets found him, for the way time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously until seconds felt like hours and hours passed in heartbeats. You couldn't prepare for the weight of another man's life in your hands, for the terrible necessity of killing someone who was probably just as scared and homesick as you were. Jimmy's hands had trembled the first time he'd fired his rifle on the range, and his instructor, a grizzled veteran of the Pacific Theater, had noticed immediately. "You're thinking about it too much, son. Thinking about what it means, who you'll be killing. Don't. When the time comes, it's just you
and the target. Everything else falls away. If it doesn't, you'll hesitate, and hesitation gets people killed, probably you, maybe your buddies. So learn to flip that switch. Learn to be what you need to be when you need to be it. Now, running through the Norman bocage with German voices shouting in the darkness behind them, Jimmy understood what the instructor had meant. There was a part of him that had gone cold and mechanical, that registered threats and responded without conscious thought. But there was another part, the part that had grown up on a Wisconsin dairy farm, that milked cows and mended fences and sat at his mother's table saying grace before dinner, watched in horror at what he'd become. Bull's voice cut through his thoughts. "Snap out of it, kid. I need you here now. Save the philosophy for when we're not being hunted."
Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. They'd been moving for 20 minutes, zigzagging through the bocage maze while trying to keep their general bearing toward the coast. Eddie was on point, his Thompson submachine gun at the ready, while Bull brought up the rear despite the blood still crusting his face from the wound he'd taken in the farmhouse. Jimmy was in the middle, the captured documents heavy in his pack, a burden that seemed to grow heavier with each step. The sky was definitely lightening now, the absolute black of night fading to charcoal gray. In maybe an hour, the sun would rise on D-Day, and thousands of Allied soldiers would storm the beaches while the full weight of Hitler's Atlantic wall defenses tried to push them back into the sea. Everything they'd planned, everything they'd sacrificed would come down to a few hours of blood and terror on a stretch of French coastline that most of the men dying there had never heard of before they'd received their orders. "Contact, left!" Eddie's warning came a split second before a German machine gun opened up, rounds chewing through the hedgerow just above their heads. They hit the ground hard, pressing themselves into the muddy earth that smelled of manure and rotting vegetation. The machine gun was maybe 50 yards away, hidden behind a stone wall that probably marked some farmer's property line. Bull was already moving, crawling on his belly toward a gap in the hedge. "Cover fire! We can't go around, so we go through. On my signal, light them up. I'll flank right. Eddie, you're with me. Jimmy, you keep that pack safe and give us covering fire. Those documents are worth more than our lives." Jimmy wanted to protest, wanted to say that no piece of paper was worth dying for, but he bit back the words and checked his rifle instead, counting his remaining ammunition. 2 full magazines plus the one in his weapon. He'd used more than he'd realized in the farmhouse fight. He'd have to make every shot count. Bull's hand signal came, a quick chop of motion, and Jimmy rose to a crouch and started firing. He didn't aim at specific targets because he couldn't see any in the pre-dawn gloom. Instead, he put rounds downrange toward where the muzzle flashes had originated. The rifle's recoil familiar now, almost comforting in its consistency. Beside him, Eddie's Thompson chattered in short, controlled bursts, the kind of disciplined fire that showed he wasn't quite as reckless as he pretended to be. Movement to the right. Bull's massive form ghosting through the shadows, moving faster than a man his size should be able to move. The machine gun swiveled toward him, and Jimmy's heart lurched with fear. But then Bull was throwing something, and 3 seconds later a grenade exploded behind the stone wall. The machine gun went silent. "Clear! Move up!" Bull's voice carried across the field, and they ran forward to find 3 German soldiers dead or dying behind their defensive position. The machine gun, a Czech-made ZB-26 rather than the feared MG-42, sat silent, its ammunition belt spent. One of the Germans, a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, reached toward Jimmy with a blood-slicked hand, saying something in German that might have been a prayer or a plea. Doc Martinez materialized from the darkness like a ghost. Jimmy hadn't even realized the medic had caught up with them. "Let me see him," Doc said quietly. Kneeling beside the wounded German, his hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking for wounds, assessing what could be saved and what was beyond help. After a moment, he sat back on his heels and shook his head. "Nothing I can do. Grenade fragments hit his abdomen. He's got maybe 5 minutes." "We don't have 5 minutes. The Krauts will have more patrols converging on this position. We need to move. I'm not leaving him to die alone, Doc said, and there was steel in his voice that Jimmy had never heard before. You go. I'll catch up.
Bull started to argue, then stopped. Some lines you didn't cross, even in war. He nodded once, sharply. 2 minutes. Then you haul ass after us. That's an order, Doc. They moved on, leaving Doc Martinez kneeling beside the dying German boy, one hand on his shoulder, the other clutching the wooden crucifix his grandmother had given him. Jimmy looked back once and saw Doc's lips moving, and he knew the medic was offering what comfort he could. Prayer, presence, the simple dignity of not dying alone in the mud. The hedgerow maze finally gave way to a more open landscape, farmland that rolled gently toward the coast. In the growing light, Jimmy could see the Atlantic for the first time, a dark line on the horizon that seemed to pulse with some vast, barely contained energy. Somewhere out there, ships were moving into position. Landing craft were being loaded with men who had no idea what awaited them. The entire weight of the Allied war effort was about to crash against the Atlantic Wall defenses, and the outcome would determine the fate of nations. There, Lieutenant Winters said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings about a mile distant. That's Ravenoville. If we can reach the church steeple, we can signal the fleet, get them the intel on beach defenses before the first wave hits. But we're running out of time. Sun's coming up, and when it does, we're going to be visible for miles. They ran, no longer trying for stealth. Speed was everything now. Jimmy's lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead, but he kept moving. Frank's letter was still in his pocket, creased and worn, and he thought about his brother's words. Maybe we're meant for this. Maybe they were. Maybe this desperate run across occupied France with information that could save thousands of lives was exactly what they were meant for. Tom Chin fell in beside Jimmy, his breathing labored but steady. You know what's funny? He said between gasps for air. I spent my whole life trying to prove I was American enough, and now here I am, about to die in France for a country that still sees me as a foreigner. But I'd do it again, every time. Because this matters, Jimmy. What we're doing right now, this matters more than anything we'll ever do. Before Jimmy could respond, the world exploded. Artillery rounds, American artillery from the sound of them, began falling on German positions inland. The naval bombardment had begun, thousands of tons of high explosive being hurled at the Atlantic Wall defenses that seemed so impregnable just hours before. Jimmy and his squad reached Ravenoville's church as the first rays of sunlight broke over Normandy. From the steeple, they signaled the fleet, transmitting the captured intelligence that would guide the landing forces past hidden obstacles and fortified positions. Below them, landing craft churned toward Utah Beach. The documents in Jimmy's pack, bought with blood and sacrifice, would save countless lives. As the invasion force hit the beaches, Jimmy thought of Frank's letter, understanding now what his brother had meant. They were meant for this, all of them.